This is Dyslexic Design Thinking. For the past 25 years, Gil Gershoni has been the head of his own branding agency, Gershoni Creative, and one of the things he's passionate about rebranding is his dyslexia. In this series, Gil sits down with members of the dyslexic community for eye-opening conversations about the intersection of dyslexia and creativity, and what dyslexia can teach us about ourselves and the world around us. Today, Gil talks to Jeffrey Conger, an educator, designer, photographer, and author. Jeffrey is a professor of graphic design at Montana State University in Bozeman. He is also the co-founder of the annual Dyslexia and Innovation Symposium, which celebrates the strengths of the dyslexic mind. Jeffrey's writing and photography has appeared in numerous automotive magazines and publications, including Hot Rod and Corvette Enthusiast. Enjoy!
It's so great to have you today.
Well, Gil, it's an honor to be here. Just really excited to chat with you today.
Thank you. Thank you. I have so many things I want to cover with you today. But maybe the first thing I should ask you is, what is your favorite car?
Oh my gosh, my favorite car. So you know I'm a motorhead, right?
Yes.
And I was fortunate to work with Hot Rod magazine for over a decade. And so the whole podcast could be about a list of cars, but it really kind of goes at muscle cars are awesome. You know, that's kind of the genre that I grew up with. So anything with a big motor and, you know, a Cuda is always nice or a Mustang's nice. Camaro's always good. There's some good lines in there. But, you know, also Ferrari. Ferrari's a good car too. So there's just too many to even narrow it to one.
What do you drive today?
I have a family rig. We love to ski. And so we've got a rig with snow tires and all-wheel drive, and it gets us to the mountain. It fits the skis, it fits the kids, fits the family. But my sweetheart, she drives she's got a 92 Chevy pickup that comes out in the summer that's rear-wheel drive.
Nice. Do you drive the speed limit?
You know, Montana's notorious. We have a maverick spirit here in Montana. When I first moved here, we didn't even have a speed limit. It was an energy waste tax. So if you got pulled over during the daytime going an excessive speed, you basically got a fine for using too many resources, and then they would send you on your way. Obviously, that's changed and we have a speed limit now. But I always enjoy going to the racetrack, whether it be a drag strip or a road course or a natural terrain or even Bonneville Salt Flats. So I enjoy speed.
I love it. I love it. I know you grew up in a rural area of the Rocky Mountains. What was childhood like for you living in a small community?
I was awesome. You know, I've spent most of my life in the Rocky Mountains and we love the mountains. You know, we grew up fishing and hiking and skiing. And I tried, like I said, I tried living on the East Coast for about 20 minutes. And I tried living on the West Coast for about 25 minutes. And if I can't see the mountains, I get disoriented. And so it always pulls me back. In the town that we grew up in, so my folks met in Colorado, and my oldest brother was born while they were still in college. My dad was a veterinarian at Colorado State, and my middle brother was actually born here in Montana, and then my sister and I were born in Idaho. If you know Idaho, think of Boise, then keep going farther out, go to Caldwell, keep going to Marcine, and out there in the middle of nowhere is Chicken Dinner Road, and we were not too far from Chicken Dinner Road. So that was our rural upbringing. It was delightful. We just had roam, right? We just trundled around, and it was a really great time and place.
Sounds amazing. What did the future look like as you were growing up?
Well, you know, we're a product of our environment largely. And in my family, there was professions that were definitely profiled across my uncles and my grandparents. And so engineering was a profession, obviously medicine. My brother's a doctor. My dad was a veterinarian. And then later I found out education was really a part of our family. Both of my grandparents graduated from college in a time when women didn't go to college. And they were kind of my quiet heroes, quiet giants, right? And my grandmother, Arabella de Oliveira, she went from Frio Dra, New Mexico to USC and graduated from USC. And she was a suffragette and total badass. She helped found a women's empowerment group that's still on the campus today, 100 years later.
So when did art and creation, or when did art and photography come into your life?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gil. So growing up, we were centered around going into town, and especially in the summers, we had the city park. And so we had swim team and we had baseball and we had golf lessons. Anything that the municipal park had, we jumped on that. And so I remember asking my mom, and there was 4 of us, right? And so resources were pretty light. And I said, what about art, right? And my mom was one of my biggest champions and still is to this day. She's like, well, I think there's a teacher, Miss Braden, that teaches summer art classes. And maybe I could get you some summer art classes. I probably was 8, 9, or 10, but she had set up this studio in next to her garage. And she was an amazing individual and taught me, just you went in and she had this magic. She had just tools and things. What was really interesting is she'd had polio as a child. And so she had braces on her legs. And I remember later in my college career, as I went into my art class, and I thought all art teachers wore braces, right? Because my first art teacher had worn leg braces. So I'm like, yeah, it's funny what a kid gets into their mind.
You reminded me of a moment in my childhood that I haven't thought of in 30 years. I was probably around the same age as you are, and probably asking my mom to do some sort of artistic project or to do something. And she connected me with an art teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it was during the summer. And she would take me to these long walks, in the woods and in parks, and got me out there. And we would just sit by the tree and just sketch. And she taught me how to single line draw a tree. And then we would go to, again, she had this, she made this little studio, and she taught me how to make paper. We take all sorts of fibers and materials and sort of grind them down and then put them in the water. And I was so little, but I always remember some of those techniques, and, it made me feel so present and so alive and so connected to my environment. Only later on, I realized that was kind of feeding my dyslexia, and it gave me a very early on that relationship with that. Did you have that kind of experience?
Absolutely. And for me, Gail, drawing was always easy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it be sketching, doodling in my notebook, or actually asking to get a notebook or a sketchbook. And obviously there was no art store in our town, right? And so we would go to the stationery store and improvise. And one of the stores in town that everybody went to was called Pennywise Drug, and it had everything, right? It wasn't just a drugstore downstairs. It had the sporting goods, and it had a little toy section. And that's where we got our shoes, right? Because my dad received a discount because he was a doctor. And so probably the first 10 years of my life, every pair of shoes I had came from Pennywise Drug. But fortunately, across the street was another store that was called Bucky's Bikes. And Bucky's sold chainsaws in the winter and bikes in the summer. And somewhere around 7 or 8, I got a Stingray bike. And that just opened up freedom. And that idea of drawing and riding my bike. And, we just had a great time. It was a wonderful place to grow up.
Do you remember the first thing that you photographed?
Well, my dad always carried a camera. And I think that came out of being in the service. I think he had his first camera in the service. And when we backpack, he would always take a 35 millimeter camera. And, I was in my teens, and my grandmother in Colorado, she asked us, she was really good at spoiling us. And so she's like, what do you want for Christmas? And really, she was the only one that didn't care about budget, right? And so you got your first pick, and I'm like, I want one of these small, pocket spy cameras. I think Minolta made it at that time. And the film was just, minuscule, but she got it for me. And I still have it to this day. And that was my first camera. And, the pictures are just terrible, right? Because it's like the negative is probably, smaller than your thumbnail. And, I didn't know anything about it, but I carried it everywhere on my bike, and I took pictures. We rode out, on the trails or jumps or, my friends, and we ran through a lot of film. And I don't think there's one publishable shot in there, but it was, it was a great learning ground. So yeah, I would have to say just that family connection of one person spoiling you or listening to you and saying, where's your creativity? And each one of us are so different. My 4 siblings and I were so different in our profession, but she would lean in and she took notes, right? She would be on the other end, and she was an awesome lady.
I know that you were self-taught photographer. I mean, it seems like you've been self-taught all your life. So, I mean, is it like, have you been focusing on learning to, the craft of photography?
Well, I was fortunate to go to college, right? And it's a wonderful land-grant university. And the great thing about land-grant universities is you have so many opportunities when you get there. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I actually found graphic design by accident. I was walking through the hallway, and I remember there was a whole group of kids lined up. And at that time, students had to meet with their advisors individually in person. And there was a whole group of kids sitting in the hallway waiting to meet with this one professor. And I said, what's going on here? And I'll never forget it. There was an amazing graphic designer named Steve Bragg. He jumped up and he says, hey, I'll show you what the creative industry is all about. And he took me into the studio and he showed me logos and he showed me what they were working on branding. He showed me publication design and they were doing some 3D work for a big jazz event. And he just really compartmentalized it in what I'm guessing was maybe 4 minutes. And in that moment, I understood that the creative industry existed. Right out of undergrad, I worked into marketing and advertising. And fortunate to work with some amazing photographers that had been classically trained at the top schools in the country. And while I was art directing, I would just take notes. I would have my clients' notes in one notebook, and then I would have notes about photography in another notebook. And I'll never forget, one day we had a really big push for a client that needed turnaround in 24 hours. So I went over to see my photographer that I'd been art directing with. And I said, hey, we got to shoot this today. He says, sorry, I'm already booked up. Studio's already booked up. And he literally handed me his Nikon at the door. He says, you can shoot this. You got this. And I'm like, what? And so he handed me his backup camera. He's like, bring it back tomorrow morning. You got this. He goes, I know, I've been watching you. You've been taking notes. And that transformed me. And he's still a top shooter today. He's published, 20 books about the West and just an amazing human being. But he saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. That combination of design and content creation and photography has always been there.
That is such an interesting way to sort of find your way into new opportunities and your talents. And how did you find the confidence, as you just said, to sort of take that leap and to sort of challenge yourself that way?
Our family's always had a maverick spirit, right? And living in the Rocky Mountains is kind of double down on that maverick spirit. You make something out of nothing. And I watched my grandparents do it. I watched my parents do it. I've watched my siblings do it. And now my kids are doing it, right? And I don't know if it's innate. I don't know if it's learned. I don't know if it's in the water, but it's definitely in the mountains. I think it's a little bit harder, right? The elements can actually kill you. And not that they can't kill you in other places, but if you slide off the road, you need help from your neighbor. And so that idea of creating your own workaround is something that is part dyslexia and part me, but my dyslexia has always been with me, right? I'm better at describing it now, but it's always been a part of my journey, my path, my life. And yeah, so I don't know. I think it's in the water.
Do you remember the first teacher who saw you for who you were?
Oh, for sure. I can tell you exactly who that was. It was Mrs. Shepard in the 4th grade. Mrs. Shepard in the 4th grade was awesome. And at that time, they had these SRA reading assessments, right? And I was really bad at reading because I had undiagnosed dyslexia. And so she called my mom and said, we need to talk about Jeff's reading. He's not reading at grade. Dyslexia wasn't really a term. It wasn't even understood. But she knew that my comprehension wasn't on par. And so her recommendation was for our family to buy a picture dictionary, right? So it had the definitions and then it had a picture next to it. And we know that that's the way people learn. Well, it was 1995, right? And put it in today's dollars, that would have been like 199, 50. So it was times 10. So it was like a $200 book. And I remember my dad, I overheard them at dinner. And he's like, Shirley, do you think he really needs it? Right? Because it was a big portion of the family budget that month. I mean, it far exceeded our phone bill, right? And it's like, oh my gosh, that one book for one kid. And she said, yeah, he really needs it. And so Mrs. Shepard went to bat for me. those teachers are amazing. And then in high school, there was two teachers that really, I would say, carved my path. And one was an art teacher and the other was the auto shop teacher.
That
So,
makes sense.
yeah, right. So Ed Trawick was our retired Marine that was the auto shop teacher. He told great stories. I really enjoyed that class. And then my art teacher, Cheryl Shurtleff Young, who's really well known in that part of Idaho. She went on to become a professor at Boise State University and a very well-known artist. I had her, I think, as her first or second year of teaching. And that dual combination of studio and shop, right? Because it gave a freedom for me to create content. And it later definitely obviously came up working for motorsports publications, whether it was a Corvette magazine or whether it was Hot Rod or American Rod or whatever.
Yeah. What about their teaching technique stood out or spoke to you?
Well, I think you said it, they saw me for who I was, right? They would give me assignments that fit my next level of development. Ed Trawick was responsible for making a phone call to get me my very first job as a teenager, right? And serving as kind of an invisible reference. And then Cheryl Shurtleff Young became a mentor when I became a professor. She arced my entire career until she passed away, where if I had a tough question, whether it be about promotion or tenure or something, I could always reach out to her. And she's just super wise and capable, and both of them awesome storytellers, right? So that was great. So yeah, so Mr. Trawick would entertain us with his time in the Marine Corps, and Cheryl she knew living artists, right? So wow, that was new in our community.
I understand that you were not diagnosed as a dyslexic until you were much older. How did that come about?
I was probably in my mid-20s. It was, I'll never tell you what my GPA was for undergraduate, but I think the evidence of knowing, and that's why I'm a big advocate for screening, the difference between knowing and not knowing is power. Information is power. And so I was probably in graduate school when someone came up to me and they said, I think you're dyslexic. And I said, what, lexic? I didn't even know the word, right? And as you might guess, in graduate school, there's a lot of reading, right? And research and whatnot. And so if you came to my apartment while I was in graduate school, there was 4 things in that apartment. There was a table, there was a bed, there was a chair, kind of an Eames style chair, and there was a lamp. And my first year of graduate school, I read 70 books. And I had never, ever read like that, just powered through it. And I became a much better reader. Yeah. And so that began my journey to understanding dyslexia, was probably in graduate school. And then obviously there was more research done. We were kind of into the second wave of understanding, and it sparked it. And I could start to see it in other people. Right. And then when our children were born, then you can really see it, right? You can see it because it's genetic, and we know that that's passed through your genes, right? It's like eye color or hair color or any other attribute you get from your ancestors. So then I started reaching out to my family members, right? And my Uncle Bruce, who was an engineer for Boeing for decades, I reached out to him in Seattle and I said, hey, Uncle Bruce, I just learned that, I'm dyslexic, and maybe some of the family members are dyslexic. I said, are you dyslexic? He says, no. And I could hear his wife, my Aunt Neoma, in the back room goes, hell yes, he's dyslexic. I've been proofing his stuff for 30 years, right? And so that awareness, I think, is really refreshing. But also, too, he had all of the strengths of the dyslexic mind that made him an amazing engineer for Boeing, whether it be seeing complex patterns or whether that be that spatial understanding. All of those strength sides are what made him an exceptionally successful aeronautical engineer.
What changed after you found out you were dyslexic?
I would have to say just starting to look for ways to succeed even more, work on the strengths, and what I call fund the strengths or support the strengths, whether that be through mentorship or equipment. When I first started shooting, like I said, as self-taught, I did something quite strange where I didn't charge an invoice for my clients. I would actually have them I'd have them pay me in lenses and camera bodies. And so I would actually have them go and just buy me a professional lens or buy me a professional body. And what that did for me was it just validated where I wanted to go next. And then I could build out my kit. And also, too, then I didn't have to look at the numbers. Wow, that body was $2,000 or that lens was $4,000, right? And so it took the money or it took the number quotient out and it funded the opportunities in the future. And then I worked on weaknesses. Like I said, one of the reasons I became a writer, not because I think I'm a great writer. I do think I have things to say. But the reason I wanted to become a writer or an author is because it was the biggest challenge of my life, right? And so it's like telling someone that can't walk that you're going to walk. And the first time I saw my work published nationally, I was so proud, and it's pretty rough around the edges, I'll just be honest. But it was the first time. And then a few hundred articles later, I got pretty good at it, right? I made a trajectory where it's just like, I want to move from this point to that point to this point. And whether that be through actual research or mall research, where I would just go to the bookstore and say, okay, this publisher obviously is more significant than that publisher. And so I basically built my own roadmap.
I love how you found a way to sort of challenge yourself and overcome those obstacles to do the amazing things you're doing today. Did you have somebody in your life at the time that encourages you to sort of try to overcome or try to push toward these challenges?
Well, I think for any successful neurodivergent individual, whether it's dyslexia or anything, to be successful, I think you have to acquire grit and tenacity. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's a genetic trait of neurodiversity at all. What I see, in Montana, one of our amazing hero cult town classics is Robert Craig Knievel, better known as Evel Knievel, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And everybody pretty much thinks he was dyslexic, right? But I think what is interesting is most dyslexics are willing to take greater risk, right? Because they've been brought down to such a low level. I think most of the dyslexics, and even the ones that I mentor today, through the lessons of life, they learn to either take greater physical risks, greater financial risks, or greater emotional risks. Because you've been down on your knees, you've been knocked down. Mm-hmm. And so why not? Why not take a risk? What's the worst thing that's going to happen? When I was first breaking into publishing for magazines, what was the worst thing that was going to happen? I was going to get a rejection letter. Well, those make great fire starters. So, mm-hmm. Just keep going, right?
Right.
And so I look at especially successful dyslexics. And this is a Jeffism, is I think that they're just willing to take more risk.
Yeah.
And whatever that means, especially if they want to get to that next level. And one of the strength side of the dyslexic mind is that pattern recognition. Mm-hmm. And so if we think of people like Charles Schwab, or if we think of people like, Florence from Florence and the Machine, and there's two totally different pattern recognitions. One is patterns in the stock market, and the other is patterns in music. But as dyslexics, they see them for what they are, and then they find a way to leverage that. Mm-hmm. And so I think all of those things get us to the next level.
I know you've been teaching at the Montana State University for the last 17 years. How did that come about? What influenced you to teach at the university? Tell me a little bit about that story.
I came to Montana for a 10-month job almost 20 years ago. And I came originally as a full-time adjunct professor. And it was an amazing opportunity. And the team here within the School of Art and the Graphic Design program is exceptional. It's a land-grant university that, to use a sports metaphor, they always kind of box about 2 classes above their weight. And so they're doing these amazing things. And so when I first came, I had really wonderful mentorship from my colleagues. And then we've had wonderful growth with our current administration. Our current President Cruzado, has just really been able to grow the whole institution holistically in a lot of different ways. And so, yeah, it was just a good fit. I had no idea we were going to raise our children here. At one point it was kind of a stop along the way, but it became more than that. And largely that had to do with the students. And it doesn't matter if the students grew up in Montana, if they're multi-generation Montana, or whether they were lured to Montana. There's that, it's mythical. Montana's mythical. And we attract a very hardworking, gritty, can-do individual. And so working with these students, it's just, as an instructor, as a professor, it's so refreshing. It's so delightful. If you look at my LinkedIn profile, it doesn't say professor. It says educator, creative, dyslexic. Right now, I am a professor. That's my title. And I'm very proud of that, the work that we've done to become a full professor. But at the end of the day, that's a title. And who I am is I am an educator. I am a creative, but I've been a lifetime dyslexic.
I know you develop a reputation for helping students to fall through the cracks. How do you identify those students that may need additional support? What do you look for and what do you listen for?
That's a great question. About 10 years ago, I got really good at looking at patterns in students' transcripts as they navigated, especially higher ed. And not through a formula, but just through seeing where they got A's or B's or D's or F's, I could pretty much tell, or pretty high probability, whether they were neurodivergent or not. And so I started working with students that were on academic probation, just on my lunch hours. It wasn't a formal part of my job. I could just see students that were, because kind of you get one semester to rebuild your GPA, and then you get a warning, and then you're out, right? Mm-hmm. And every school is different on how long it takes you to be removed from that. But it didn't make sense to me, because students would be having high grades in these really challenging design classes that were extremely hard. But then they were maybe failing a core class, which is fairly simple, right? Or what you would think was fairly simple. And I started to realize that it had to do with the modality of instruction usually, right? Whether it was project-based or whether it was multiple choice or whether it was lecture or whatever, because obviously students that are neurodivergent have a hard time in lectures just taking in the three things that are going on: writing, listening, and also retaining knowledge. And spelling, if you're dyslexic, you're trying to spell, so you can't think about what they're trying to say. And so I just started mentoring these students on my lunch hour. And that really kind of became what was the launch for what has become the Dyslexia Symposium.
So you co-founded the Dyslexia Innovation Symposium at Montana State University. Tell me a little bit about this symposium. How did that come about?
Yeah. Well, I told you we have this amazing president, and one day I received an email from her assistant, and it says, "See me immediately." And at that time, we were having some staffing issues in the department. So I thought, wow, the president wants to see me about these staffing issues. So I stayed up all night writing, about this problem that I thought that she wanted to talk to me about. So I go in, and the president works in basically a 30-minute efficiency. So there's 3 minutes of nicety and 27 minutes worth of business. So we get through the 3 minutes of nicety, and the president says to me, she says directly, she leans forward in her chair and she says, "Jeffrey, have you thought about your future here at MSU?"
Oh, no.
Oh my God. My mouth dropped, and in the back of my head, I'm thinking, I'm losing my job today. And she said to me, she said, "Well, I hear a rumor that you're mentoring dyslexic students on your lunch hour. I want to know if that's true or not." Oh my gosh, I exhaled again. I'm not getting fired today. And I said, "Yes, and let me tell you about it." So basically, I told her all the things that we've been talking about and how I'd become, figured out how to assist students that were basically on the verge of dropping out of school. And she said, "When you leave here today, there's some opportunities that I think that you may not know about that might be in alignment with what you're trying to do. And not to say that it's a guarantee you're going to have to compete for them like everybody else that is, applying for these opportunities. But I think they might be in line with what you're going to do." And that was a little over 10 years ago. And we started with a statewide dyslexia awareness campaign that went through all of the campuses, and it was really effective. And it was in an alignment with the state legislation, getting the first dyslexia bill passed. And we just raised awareness. And then that grew into the symposium, the first symposium that I co-founded with Dr. Sarah Pennington, one of my colleagues at the university. She's amazing. She teaches in education, so she teaches the next generation of educators, and she's also has huge interest in eye tracking related to reading, and so she has strengths and amazing things that I don't have, but she also has a strong compassion to dyslexia for several personal reasons. And so we wrote, about 5 years ago, we wrote a grant to launch the symposium, and next October we will have our fourth symposium here on the campus.
That's so exciting. Tell me about this year's symposium. What's in the plans? What should we look forward to?
Well, how we're different is there's a lot of conferences and symposiums about dyslexia, but most of them are about fluency or reading or trying to fix you. And they're great. That's awesome. We need those. But there's definitely not very many events that are focused on the strength side. And so this symposium is 100% focused on spotlighting the strengths of the dyslexic mind. And whether that be in education, whether that be in sports, whether that be in entrepreneurship, we definitely break down those silos. And we want to have a 21st conversation about what is the new definition of dyslexia. And let's focus on some of these strengths and let's have a balanced approach. If we're going to take 3 hours of your week and we're going to work on spelling or we're going to work on grammar, we need to take 3 hours of your week and work on your strengths, right? And that's why we created the symposium. And with Dr. Pennington and myself as co-founders, I'm a lifetime dyslexic and bring that kind of hard knocks understanding to it. And then she brings this idea of systemic and cultural change of how can we teach the teachers or how can we change policies so that we have better universal design.
I would love to be part of that and support in any way I can.
Thank you. We'll definitely engage you. And once again, it's a platform in addition to spotlighting the strengths, much like what you're doing here, is we have a lot of people that participate, whether they be students or professionals, that maybe this is the first time that they've publicly talked about their challenges. And one person comes to mind, actually an alumni of our Montana State University. She came on a skiing scholarship and now is one of the most noted female big mountain skiers on the planet. And her name's Lindsay Dyer, and she lives outside of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And she's sponsored by, little companies like GoPro and, Eddie Bauer. And she helped create the first all-women's ski film. She raised, $160,000 on Kickstarter to create a movie that opened in 60 cities nationwide, right? This is just her day to day, right? But she's amazing. And we invited her back. And I think it was the very, very first time that she'd publicly spoken about dyslexia. And I could see that she was noticeably nervous. And I'm like, how can you be nervous? You jump off out of helicopters onto these 12,000 foot peaks and ski down faces that no human have ever come, skied down before. How can you be nervous? It's going in front of, 300 people. She said, I've never talked about this. And so she came in and she spoke and she knocked it out of the park. But once again, that idea that there is a new story being told, there is something that we can learn, not only from other dyslexics, but from parents or administrators or researchers. So that's one of the reasons that we created the symposium, is to change that narrative or assist in changing that narrative.
I know that you lost your voice, for a period of time. That's scary. Tell me a little bit about that and how did that affect your outcome?
Wow, you've done your research, so thank you. Yeah, about 11 years ago, my family physician inadvertently tried to kill me, right? Metaphorically, right? And prescribed a drug that it was a steroid inhaler that I had a very, very violent reaction to. And it basically chemical burn in my mouth and throat and voice box, right? Yeah. All the way down. My family has a history of strange allergies, right? And this just was one of them. So it's like one in a million things that happened. But the outcome didn't change the outcome. I couldn't speak for a year. And
for a year? Oh, wow.
Yeah. So as a educator, you're really a professional voice user. And I had to learn to speak again, breathe again, walk again, talk again, eat and stand. And so through probably, I don't know, maybe 300 medical visits, I'm able to speak to you again, right?
Wow.
But I put together an A team, amazing A team. It was during that time that, I think you've even had these people on your podcast. It was during this time that I discovered Dr. Brock and Fernette Ides' book.
Yeah.
So I was rehabilitating, so sleeping about 18 hours a day. I would be up for 4. And so I just discovered Audible at that time, and they had recently put out the Dyslexic Advantage in Audible form. And I think I read that book or read that book 7 times while I got better. And I made a promise. I always make promises to the kids, but for this time, I don't know why. I made a mental promise to my daughter that if I ever get my voice back, I'll use it for something other than talking about hot rods and cars. And so as I got my voice back, and it came back, I mean, it's a little bit rough today, but as it came back, it became clear that I wanted to take everything that I learned as a content creator for global publishing giants, whether that be writing or photo editing or art direction or trend following. I wanted to take that skill set and translate it into dyslexia and spotlighting dyslexia as a strength. And so when I got my voice back, and it's come back, it's different. It's not the same. My sense of humor came back, and it's different. It's not the same. But when those two came back, the timing for the symposium, the timing for the new research endeavors, the timing for new scholarly work was evident.
As dyslexic, we struggle so much at school. And as an educator, have you seen or have you identified some creative hacks that are helpful for people with dyslexia as they go through the educational system?
I think every dyslexic has to find a successful way to note take. And I say that in a very broad sense. Note taking can be recording. Note taking could be writing down one word. Note taking could be using the Office of Disability Services to have a hired note taker for you so that you can concentrate on the knowledge. And that's why so many dyslexics entrepreneurs, because they can actually hire those skills done that maybe they aren't naturally gifted at. And so I think anyone, especially in higher ed or even in K through 12 as dyslexics, they have to find a workaround for note-taking that's effective for them. And the process that I use isn't the same that my kids are going to use, or even my kids are going to use 2 different systems. But you have to find a way that it works for you. For me, in a stressful situation, I get what we call adrenaline wipe. And so within those first 30 seconds, like if I'm on stage to introduce a speaker, the adrenaline floods through my body and it interrupts my short-term memory, right? And so I may have known you for the last 25 years, but I get on stage and I can't remember your first name is Gil, right? And so, but I know that about myself. And so my note-taking when I get into those situations is I want to get at the words that I need. I need to get at those words that I need effectively. And whether that be through note-taking or whether that be through a digital device or whether that be from cue cards or whatever, we have to make up a system. And once again, dyslexia doesn't all fit in one box fits all, one size fits all. So you have to develop a system that makes sense to you. A lot of times when I do public speaking, I will have a note card that just has one word on it, or I'll have 5 note cards. And it's like, that reminds me I'm going to speak about this. That gets me going and it keeps me moving. Every neurodivergent needs to find that method that works for them.
How do we help them create a paradigm shift that I'm not disabled, but I am able and maybe even hyper ability, you know?
Well, I think that that's true for all students, whether they're neurodivergent or not, right? We have so many distractions, whether it be social media, whether it be, likes or whatnot. As instructors, as teachers, one, we need to find practices, methods that instill, whether it be muscle memory, right, or whether it be challenging people in a safe environment to push their skills to the next level. One of the things that I like about education is I know that we're playing with, in a metaphorically way, we're playing with monopoly money, right? Mm-hmm. So the worst situation is a bad grade. And we talk about that, especially in our upper level classes, is that this is an opportunity to stretch. This isn't about the completion. This is about growth. And especially like with our capstone experience, right? I'll tell students that this is a wonderful opportunity to fail, right? And I'm not saying not fail the class, but to fail in the project that you initially started out on. Maybe it takes more time. Maybe it's you decide that it's something that you don't want to do. But in life, that's the true lesson. We learn as much from what we don't want to do as what we do want to do, right? Mm-hmm. And so the lessons, the kind of these hard knocks are real. And so I think the key, when you look at successful educators at any point in their career, they're creating an environment that, one, intrigues, engages, and then creates an opportunity for dynamic growth. But well knowing that maybe the outcome isn't necessarily the most important. It's maybe how you got there that's more important than the outcome.
Do you find that teaching them their strength, is their strength different than their confidence? Is there a different way of teaching a person where their confidence lies so they can tackle these challenges differently?
That's a funny thing. You must have been tapping into a lecture I just gave a couple of weeks ago. We just had college graduation. And so I give a lecture that talks about going to the bookstore to get your cap and gown. And if you look closely, if you go past the cap and gown before you get into the textbooks, there's a little over there, it looks like glitter. And it's over there in the art section. And so if you go to the glitter and go to the right, there's a little vial of confidence. And what I want you to do is go and buy that vial of confidence. I'm going to come back in. I'm going to sprinkle it on your shoulders. But I don't want you to buy the vial of arrogance, because that's not what we want. We just want that little pixie dust that is the vial of confidence, that just a pinch, that's all it takes. It's really expensive. And when you see the vial, you say, wow, really? I'm going to pay that much for that little bit of confidence? But I said, that's what we need more of. And I think especially in our capable individuals, the landscape right now is so noisy that those that are really capable are questioning whether or not they have the confidence or they have the voice to say what really needs to happen. Yeah, so I give that lecture. I just gave it 2 weeks ago to my seniors.
What do you tell your dyslexic students?
Well, I'll tell any dyslexic, doesn't matter if they're a student or not. It's because a lot of times when you discover your dyslexia, it really it comes at different times for every person, right? I just gave a presentation earlier this week, a virtual talk. And when we got to the Q&A, it was an adult individual that said, oh my gosh, you just described exactly my whole life, right? Mm. And this is a mid-career person. So my advice is always the same, is it starts with awareness, right? Any neurodivergence, whether it be dyslexia or something else, starts with awareness, right? Do I see it? And then the question is, do I see it in myself or do I see it in those around me that I care about, right? Maybe you're a parent or maybe you're an employer. So it first starts with awareness. And then the second phase of that is ownership. And so an individual or a parent, they have to figure out how to own it, right? And for me, that was about owning the strengths as well as the weaknesses. It's all bundled as one. I can't separate it. I don't want to separate it. It's who I am. It's as important as my eye color, which I got from my family. So the next part is ownership. And that can be a long process. And it's one of the reasons we created the symposium is through that, ownership becomes relevant. Like one of the most popular talks that we do through the symposium was with the students, because they're so frank and they're so candid. And we do a panel with the students. And we actually started it just as kind of, let's try it out. And every year we do it, oh my gosh, the students, the audience loves it, right? Because they're like, this is so authentic, because they're in the middle of that ownership stage. And then the last part is, and they're kind of fused together, and you can choose either one, is action or advocacy. So advocacy as a neurodivergent, sometimes advocacy is advocacy for yourself. Sometimes it's advocacy for others. Sometimes it's action, right? So maybe you're a parent, you need to talk to your principal about a 501c3 or 504. Since 501c3 is a nonprofit, so or you need to get the accommodations, right? So that last key component is action or advocacy. And it can be quiet. I'm not talking about, advocacy doesn't have to be standing on a soapbox or creating something like the Dyslexia Symposium or doing a podcast. It can just be advocacy for someone that's an employee, can be someone that maybe is one of your partners, can be an advocacy for a family member. But it translates into action. But it first starts with awareness, moves to ownership, and then advocacy or action.
Today's conversation with you has been beautiful. So I really, really thank you for your time, for your openness, and for the work you're doing for all of us. So great to have you, Jeffrey.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
If you enjoyed our conversation today, be sure to subscribe to this series wherever you get your podcasts. Visit dyslexicdesignthinking.com to learn more about our latest initiatives, including Dear Dyslexia, the postcard project, or to book Gil to speak at your next event or conference. Stay connected on Instagram at Dyslexic Design Thinking, or drop us a line at dyslexic@gershoni.com to receive our monthly newsletter and learn more about our upcoming programming. Dyslexic Design Thinking is produced by Gershoni Creative. Until next time, be well.